for in a judicial trial in order to accelerate the course of justice. It does not eliminate the procedural guarantees required for a fair judgment. For offenses reserved to the DDF, it is up to the DDF alone on a case-by-case basis, ex officio, from the office, from the power, or at the request of the ordinary, to decide whether to proceed this way. Just like a judicial trial, an extrajudicial criminal trial can take place at the DDF, which is the case for Vigano to be entrusted to a lower authority, or be entrusted to authority. The decree of summons, the accusations made by the doctrine, the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith, right? Okay, you can put them over there. Right. How many do you have there? 19. Okay, that's a start. That's good. Okay. The decree of summons mentions the charge Vigano will face during the trial. The crime of schism is put forward because of a certain public affirmations negating the elements necessary to maintain communion with the Catholic Church, denial of legitimacy of Pope Francis, rupture of communion with him, and rejection of the Second Vatican Council. So 3 points: denial of the legitimacy of Pope Francis, rupture of communion with him, rejection of the Second Vatican Council. Following this summons, Vigano published a communique available online to respond to these accusations. He defends himself in various ways, invoking the doctrinal warnings of the current pontificate, rejecting neo-modernist errors, and asserting his case compares to that of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, also summoned in his time to the palace of the former Holy Office. It was the Holy Office of the Inquisition before. Here, there is, however, one point which significantly differentiates him from the founder of the Society of St. Pius X. Our Bishop Vigano makes a clear declaration of sedevacantism in his text. In other words, according to him, Pope Francis is not Pope. How does he explain this? Because of a, quote, defect of consent, unquote, from Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio when accepting the papacy. That is, according to Vigano, Cardinal Bergoglio considered the papacy as something other than what it really is. He accepted the pontifical office without fully consenting, and this error resulted in the nullity of his acceptance. His pontificate would therefore be that of a placeholder. Archbishop Lefebvre and the society he founded have not ventured down that perilous road. That's the end of the comment. So the Society of St. Pius X comment about Bishop Vigano is accused of 3 things. So the rejecting, where is it now? The crime of schism is put forward because of certain public affirmations, negotiating the elements necessary. The crime of schism is put forward because of certain public affirmations negating the elements necessary to maintain communion with the Catholic Church. Denial of legitimacy of the Pope Francis, rupture of communion with him, rejection of the Second Vatican Council. So to give 3 reasons for Bishop Vigano to be considered in schism. Number 1, that he denies legitimacy of Pope Francis. Number 2, the rupture of communion with him. And number 3, rejection of the Second Vatican Council. Now, and then it's interesting, the comparison, Archbishop Vigano and Archbishop Lefebvre, has been made by multiple people, not just by Archbishop Vigano himself. Father Hugo has made the comparison, Bishop Williamson has made the comparison, and other people have made the comparison that Archbishop Vigano is in many ways like a new Archbishop Lefebvre. When you look at this just specific being called to Rome, in 1974, Archbishop Lefebvre was called to Rome, but he made the declaration November 21st, 1974, in which he declared that we cannot have anything, we cannot work with neo-modernist Rome until the light of faith shines over Rome again. He was never accused of schism. He was not accused of rupture of communion. In fact, he received no accusation of any kind. He didn't even receive an accusation from which he could respond. Bishop Vigano received 3 accusations. And also, in Archbishop Lefebvre, when he ordained the priests without permission in 1975, and ordained priests in 1976. The first large class in 1976, there were 25 or 26 priests ordained, and he was declared suspended. and he was invited to come to Rome to celebrate the new Mass at least once. And if he celebrated the new Mass once, he would get permission to ordain as priest. He refused to perform that sacrilege, and then there was a decree of suspension of the society, which of course was not valid. But in fact, even canonically and legally, the proceedings against Archbishop of Vigano cannot be compared to Archbishop of Lefebvre. Vigano is accused of schism, and he rejects the legitimacy of Pope Francis and refuses communion with him. And he himself states that. What's interesting about Archbishop of Vigano is that everybody is his friend. I saw Brian McCall and Chris Ferrara talk about him just a few days ago, and also some other Novus Ordo people talk about him, and they claim Bishop Vigano is not really a sedevacantist. That's why I wanted to find this article here. Towards the end of this article here, this one's kind of long, he talks about it. You go scroll down there. I think it's towards the bottom. Let's just go straight to the bottom. Let's see, one second, what did he say? Well, he says at the bottom, he gives a new definition. This guy here gives a new definition of sedevacantism, which I'm hearing from people now. Go down to, just quickly to the end. He says sedevacantism equals the denial of all the popes since 1958. It's somewhere here. We're still for 1958 in there somewhere. Up. There's been 34 anti-popes. Archbishop Vigano has always supported the SSPX. Gives a new definition. Okay, go up a little bit. Where is it? Ah, there. No, where is it? Down, 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 down. LBG. No, that's not it. Here? Archbishop Vigano has always supported the SSPX, so to call him sedevacantist is both traitorous and shows ignorance. One cannot be a sedevacantist until he unequivocally rejects the validity of all the popes since John 23rd, something Vigano has never done. Right. So it's interesting. The first time I heard a new definition of sedevacantism was actually Father Zabi, who was ordained the same day I was. He's a German priest. We were both ordained June 25th, 1994, and three of us ordained the same day, became part of the resistance. Three of us, myself. They were ordained 6 hours ahead of me because they were ordained in Germany, and I was ordained here. We were ordained the same day. And so Father Vigano, Father Trauner, and then myself, three of us ordained the same exact day. Father Trauner is Austrian, Father Zabi is German, and then myself, an American. And then, unfortunately, both of them went in the direction of sedevacantism simply because they're sedevacantist priests and chapels, so they're willing to help them. So they kind of jumped overboard. But Father Zabi told me, I'm not a sedevacantist. Because sedevacantism is a statement of an error, and sedevacantism is a bad word. I'm just a good Catholic who firmly believes what all Catholics believe, and all Catholics should believe, and the Pope is not the Pope. So that I noticed since that time, that was 2012, that there are new brands of sedevacantists who say, we're not sedevacantist. We're not sedevacantist. Sedevacantism means that the see of St. Peter, the chair of Rome, is vacant. That the man who apparently is on it now is not a successor of St. Peter, and there's no one sitting on that chair. That's sedevacantism. So there have been many new definitions. This is the latest one from Brian McCall and Chris Ferrara. He's supposed to be a lawyer, Chris Ferrara. Notice he looks a lot older. I guess that happens. Last time I saw a picture of him, he didn't look that old. But Chris Ferrara said just a few days ago, he says, you can't call Bishop Vigano a sedevacantist because he simply says that Bishop Vigano had a defect of consent, rendering his consent to accept the office of papacy an invalid consent, and so therefore he didn't validly consent to be pope. But that doesn't mean he's sedevacantist. So that, in fact, he also says at the end, I'll let some future pope judge or something like that. I'm not making a final decision. And yet he says clearly this man his argument is that Pope Francis had a defect of consent where he said he likens it to the exact state of marriage. If a young man wants to marry a young girl and they refuse to have babies, and they refuse to be married until death, and they refuse fidelity or anything against the essence of marriage, then the marriage is null and void. That means they're not married. So Pope Francis, or Cardinal Bergoglio, when he was elected pope, he wanted to become pope specifically to destroy the Catholic Church. His purpose in becoming pope was to destroy the Catholic Church. And therefore, he had a defect of consent, because the purpose of the pope is to consent to become the head of the church in order to protect the deposit of the faith and in order to save the Catholic Church and souls. So Bishop Vigano argues that Pope Francis is not Pope Francis because he has a defect of consent. He did not consent to the papacy. He consented to destroy the church, and that's contrary to the papacy. And so we have, in any case, it's an error in moral theology and an error in law when he says that, but that's his argument, that defect of consent. But if one has a defect of consent, that means you're not married. That means you're not pope. But now we have people that like Archbishop Vigano, but they don't like Sedevacantists, like Brian McCall and Christopher Ferrara, and they say, well, he's not really Sedevacantist. And this is another thing I'm hearing recently. Sedevacantists are those people that deny all the popes since John 23rd, since 1958. So that if you deny all the popes, you're a crazy Sedevacantist. But just like Archbishop Lefebvre, that's what this guy says here, definitely short on brains, whoever he is. Archbishop Lefebvre, like Cardinal Archbishop Vigano, faithfully followed all the popes up to Pope Benedict. And he, of course, neglects to remember that there was a pope named John Paul II who excommunicated Archbishop Lefebvre. It was an invalid excommunication, but if you look in you know that John Paul II, Archbishop Lefebvre, they didn't get along. Archbishop Lefebvre made a cartoon saying John Paul II is listening to the devil and on the path to hell because of what he did at Assisi. Archbishop Lefebvre said Paul VI is leading souls to hell, and the only way to be faithful to Pope Paul VI is to stand up against everything that he's doing until the light of faith shines over Rome. However, Archbishop Vigano followed perfectly Paul VI, had no problem with him. He followed perfectly John Paul II, had no problem with him. He followed perfectly Pope Benedict and had no problem with him. And it was under Pope Francis that he had a problem, and that was the Cardinal McCarrick scandal of the homosexual pedophilia in the United States. And as far as the rest of the world is concerned, and Taylor Marshall mentioned this also a couple weeks ago. He said, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, the attack against Archbishop Vigano is angry Pope attacking whistleblower. Angry Pope getting even with whistleblower, because Archbishop Vigano blew the whistle about Pope Francis knowing about the scandal of Cardinal McCarrick, Pope Francis knowing about the evil of the homosexual pedophilia, Pope Francis covering it up, and therefore Pope Francis looks bad because of Archbishop Vigano. And as far as the world is concerned, they don't care about New Mass, Vatican II, they don't care about that. Archbishop Vigano is the one that uncovered the scandal of Cardinal McCarrick. Pope Francis is the one who's very angry about it and wants vengeance. And this is the occasion of the vengeance. So when you look at the particular battle, the real battle between Archbishop Vigano and Francis, it's not a battle about the faith. And also that his argumentation, he tries to come up with a new version of Sedevacantism in which he argues from the defect of consent that makes him not pope. So a few years ago, we did a treatise on Sedevacantism dealing with all the Sedevacantist arguments. And we go over it for a few years, and we have it here, a summary of it that we'll go through. We'll try to go through it maybe tonight, tomorrow, a little bit of it. And it doesn't have the defect of consent argument. That's a new argument brought in by Archbishop Vigano. And so it doesn't have a dealing directly with the problem of the so-called defect of consent argument. The state of Vatican don't usually argue from that. That Archbishop, that Cardinal Bergoglio had a defect of consent. We have a saying in canon law and moral theology that is to be remembered: the causa nubendi cannot be the causa dissolvandi. We can pop that thing back up again. The causa nubendi. Where's the button? Okay. Yeah. See, the causa nubendi. A lot of times when we deal with problems in the church, you bring up something called marriage. So, for instance, whenever you're dealing with a problem that's a last-minute problem, it doesn't have to be about marriage, and you have to give a dispensation, or you got to fix the problem immediately without recourse to the authority. We call that omnia parata sunt ad nuptias. Everything is ready for the marriage, and then you find out they're first cousins. Everything is ready for the marriage, and you find out they have some impediment. But she's in the white dress, he's there, the family is there. There's no time to write to the bishop and get a dispensation. So the priest has an omnia parata sunt ad nuptias option, which he'll give the dispensation right then and there, and then afterwards tell the bishop, I gave the dispensation that you were going to give. And so that's called omnia parata sunt ad nuptias. So when things have to be done at the last minute, because everything goes wrong and there's something you forgot, that's omnia parata sunt ad nuptias. The other one is causa nubendi, cannot be, I'm forgetting, we'll just put English in there, cannot be causa dissolvandi. This is the principle of law. Oh, dissolvendi. Okay. Cannot be a causa dissolvendi. So that means the cause or the reason of marrying cannot be the cause or the reason of dissolving, of making it invalid, right? So you have, for instance, a young girl and a young guy, like the case in Arkansas. I met a girl and I kissed her on the jaw, and then she went home and she told her pa, and we had a wedding under military law, because that's the way they do in Arkansas. So I met a girl and I kissed her on the jaw, and she went home and she told her pa, and then we had a wedding under military law, because that's the way they live in Arkansas. We got 13 children and we're living with her mom. Okay, so that's Arkansas, right? So because of marrying, a guy puts a gun to your head, says, get married. That's a good day to get married. Putting a gun to your head cannot be the reason for an invalid marriage. Because very often when you kiss a girl on the jaw, it's not the first time. And very often they want to get married anyway. But then it so happens that the brothers and the pa finds out, and you have a wedding under military law ahead of schedule due to a premature baby. So the fact is that cause of marrying cannot itself be the cause of dissolving the marriage. There must be something else that dissolves the marriage. That maybe you did not want to marry the girl because you were pressured, you did not want to marry the girl, you didn't like the girl, you didn't want to be married, and that would be the reason for not being a valid marriage. But the shotgun is not a reason for it to be an invalid marriage. The shotgun can be like, why did they have to use a shotgun? It might be because you didn't really want to get married. So a shotgun can be an occasion or a reason why you might want to investigate to see if there is an actual reason why they didn't want to get married. It could be an evidence leading towards there must be some reason, because in normal marriage you don't need a shotgun. In this particular marriage, there was a shotgun. Now, why was there a shotgun? It could be a shotgun because they got married ahead of schedule. It could be a shotgun because they did not want to get married. Then you have to investigate, why did they not want to get married? Did they refuse any of the conditions of marriage? But the shotgun, the causa nubendi, cannot be the causa disavandi. Supposing you marry a guy because he's a multi-billionaire and you have true love. That's a causa nubendi. You then find out he's a swindler and he doesn't have any stinking money and he's a liar and he's a cheat. But that doesn't mean you have an invalid marriage unless the only reason you married him was because of the money and no other reason. Then you have a case of false identity. But the causa nubendi itself can never be directly the causa dissolvendi. The cause of the marrying can't be the cause of dissolving. That applies to marriage and anything else. So in the case here of this new argument of Archbishop Vigano, he says, Cardinal Bergoglio became pope in order to destroy the church. That would be causa nubendi. That's a good way to destroy the church, is to become the head of it. It's a good way to burn it down. It's a good way to cause damage. It's a good way to spread evil, is to become the head of the church. So the cause of nubendi could be he became pope to destroy the church, which of course no one can know except for God that that's why he became pope. But that's an assumption that he became pope to destroy the church. But even if it was true he became pope to reform the church, that's a causa nubendi, which cannot be in itself a causa dissolvendi. That the reason for becoming pope was to destroy the church, which you can do much easier if you're a pope, a bishop, or a priest. So was AA 1025 a valid priest? Also in this foolish article, he says you can be no priest, no bishop, and no pope if you want to do evil, if you want to destroy the church. So obviously the guy doesn't know. AA 1025 and infiltrators of the church, they became priests specifically to destroy the church. They became priests to infiltrate the church. They went to the seminary, they lied their way through the seminary, they got ordained priests, and when they were ordained priests, they intended to be ordained priests. They intended to be ordained priests so that they could use their priesthood to destroy the church and spread communism. So the intention to do evil cannot be the reason. And also, it's actually one of the circumstances. These are called there are 7 circumstances of every act. There's an act itself, which is to kill somebody, right? You murder Mrs. Jones, right? Somebody murders Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones is innocent. Mrs. Jones is killed with a shotgun. And so Mrs. Jones is dead. Innocent girl gets her brains blown out. That's murder. But there are circumstances around that murder. So one of the circumstances, you have 7 circumstances. In Latin are quisque ubi, quibus exilius quoquemodo quando. It's a different order in English. So in English we say who, what, where, when, how, why, and by what helps. In Latin, it's a little different order. These are the 7 circumstances of every act. And why is often confused with the purpose of an act, right? But it's not the purpose of the act. So, for instance, you get married. Marriage means you intend to live with that guy and be with him as a wife or as a husband until death, and you're going to have babies and so on. That's marriage. But why do you marry him? Because he's a stinking millionaire. You marry him because he's a millionaire. The why of the act is not the same as the why that is a circumstance. You may marry him so that he doesn't marry the other girl. You may marry him because he's got a lot of money. There will be many, many whys, which are secondary whys, and are circumstances of the act and not the reason for the act itself. So when you become pope, you accept to be elected as the guy in white who's the Bishop of Rome, who rules the Church of Jesus Christ from Rome. as the Bishop of Rome, even if he's not physically there. That's what you accept to be. Now, you may want to do that in order to save souls, like St. Pius X. You want to do that in order to have prestige and power. You may want to do that in order to destroy the church. You may want to do that for any combination of reasons, and those are all circumstances. And this is one of the 7 circumstances called why. The who, for instance, a man murders Mrs. Jones. Well, who could be the husband murdered Mrs. Jones? The who is the husband. Or the son murdered Mrs. Jones. Or the robber murdered Mrs. Jones because he wanted money. So you have 3 different who's there. But the act was a man murdered an innocent woman. Who equals one of the circumstances. A priest murdered Mrs. Jones. The Pope murdered Mrs. Jones. Right? So the king murdered Mrs. Jones. The police officer murdered Mrs. Jones. So there's a lot of different states in life that can murder Mrs. Jones, and they'll have an effect on the punishment. They'll have an effect on the gravity of the crime. But the crime itself is still murdered Mrs. Jones. And so who should not to be confused with murder. And then the why is not to be confused with the purpose of the act, right? To murder an innocent person, to take away the life of an innocent person. And the why, there are many secondary whys. And what is the principal why that moved to the act? And what is the why of the act itself? The why of the act itself. So when a pagan walks down the street and he sees some guy laying on the side of the road and he says, "Baptize me." Okay, I've never heard of the word baptize before. What I want you to do is take water, pour it over my head, and say these words. So you pour the water over the head, you say the words, and the guy dies happy. What did you do? You don't know. You just tried to please that person, and you did that religious act that they somehow wanted you to do, and you acted in persona Christi. You acted in the person of Christ, and the why of the act is to wipe away original sin, which that guy doesn't even know what original sin is, to incorporate one into Christ, and the pagan doesn't even know what that is, but he knows that he's doing something ministerially that makes the guy happy. So he's performing an act in persona Christi, and he is validly baptizing, though he doesn't know what baptism is. The why of the act, he doesn't even know directly what the why of the act is, but he's performing that act validly and correctly, and the person is baptized. So because Christ is the principal author of the baptism. So in the case of the Cardinal, Archbishop Vigano's argument that Cardinal Bergoglio cannot be the Pope because the Pope is the one who defends the faith. And everybody says, what is a Pope? Pope is not the one who defends the faith. It's one of his duties and responsibilities. But the Pope is simply the Bishop of Rome. And canon law tells us, in those dogmatic canons, what's required to be a Bishop of Rome. What's required to be validly elected a Bishop of Rome? 2 things. Male, not female, baptized. If you're a baptized male, you can become the Bishop of Rome. If you're only a baptized male, you are validly elected the Bishop of Rome, but then you don't actually become the Bishop of Rome until someone puts hands on your head and makes you the bishop. You may not even believe in God. You know, when we do the mass ordination of a priest, you know what it says at the end of the ceremony? The bishop says, "You are priests now." One of the things priests do is celebrate Mass. Go find some other priest to teach you how to say Mass. That means that over the last 2,000 years, bishops ordained many men that had no idea how to say Mass. They went to the bishop, they knelt down, they got ordained, and he says, "Now you're a priest. Priests say Mass. Go find some priest to teach you how to say Mass." And whenever you do learn how to say Mass, say 3 Masses, one for me, one for the 3 Masses for me, one in the name of the Trinity, the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Holy Ghost. So there's three Masses you must say for the bishop. And it says, say 3 Masses for my intention. But even when you're ordained a priest, we always have the custom of the priest practice Mass every day for 6 months or so before they're ordained. When they're ordained, they know how to say Mass. But in the ceremony, it says, I ordained you a priest, go figure out how to say Mass. Many priests in the past, all they figured out how to do was go hunting. Martin Luther would say Mass once a year, sometimes less than that. Other priests said Mass 2 or 3 times a year. And, they didn't say Mass. Very rare. Some wicked priests did not say Mass. They had to learn how to say Mass. A priest offers sacrifice, but priesthood is to be another Christ, alter Christus. And you could be ordained a priest without ever intending to say Mass. And you would be a valid priest. So you can become a pope without intending to save the church. Because it's clear throughout the history of the church that there have been many bishops and laymen and priests who have been elected pope who did not have the intention of protecting the deposit of the faith. One of the great examples in history was Pope Vigilius. Vigilius was a wicked bishop who the Empress Theodora brought him to Rome, killed St. Silverius, whose feast was just a few days ago. They martyred St. Silverius, and then encouraged everyone to elect Vigilius Pope. That's called a forced election. And they did it, or else the Empress was going to kill them. And she had a huge army to motivate them to elect Vigilius Pope. They felt strongly motivated. They elect Vigilius Pope. And Vigilius became Pope, but he became Pope specifically for the purpose of defining heresy. That's why he became Pope. That was the condition of his papacy back in the 500s. The heresy he was supposed to define was the heresy of monothelitism, that Christ only has one will. Very clearly, there's no doubt about Pope Vigilius. He was a heretic. He murdered St. Silverius, who was just, his feast day was only a couple days ago. He was elected Pope to take his place, because it was like we had a case on the moral theology test or canon law test this year about the impediment of crimen, the impediment of crime. So that is, if a husband and wife fall in love with another husband and they realize as good Catholics that the person has to die before you marry them, so they arrange the death, followed by the marriage. The marriage is invalid because of the impediment of crime. So just put in the canon law test that the husband and wife plan the death of the other husband and wife so they get the right mix. And they sent them home from an AA meeting. And they were supposed to go to a house and have grape juice. It was poisoned. On their way to get the grape juice, they ran into a Budweiser truck. They were immersed in the Budweiser. And they got drunk from the Budweiser and died on the way to drink the poisoned fruit. So both of them died. They died in a vat of Budweiser. And the other couple, were they free to marry? Because they intended to murder the other husband and wife in order to be free to marry, because they're good Catholics, and they wanted to make sure that the other one was dead before they got married. Did the penalty of crime, did crimen, apply? And the answer is no, because they died from Budweiser. They got drunk, they had to use the restroom 3 times, they died after the 3rd time, and they were not able to make it to the poison that was waiting for them. So they had to go to confession for the intention to murder. But they didn't kill him. Not only did they not kill him, it says in canon law, bring about the death in any way. Because there's all kinds of ways in which we didn't exactly murder him, we just kind of facilitated things. And somehow it didn't come out well for them. So maybe it wasn't a murder, it was just a facilitation, speeding up of the process. And so it doesn't say the word murder, to bring about the death of the husband or the wife in order to get married is the impediment of crimen, of crime. They had the intention to commit that crime, but they didn't do it. Therefore, they don't have the impediment of crime. So They are guilty of the sin, but they don't have the impediment. And so you see here, the causa nubendi can't be the causa dissolvendi. And that in the case of Vigilius, it's extremely clear. There's no dispute. He knowingly and willingly, with an entire army behind him, went to Rome to kill the real pope, who's called St. Silverius, to become pope, knowingly, willingly, and publicly, there was no confusion about it, to confirm and define the heresy of monothelitism. So he was a heretic. He had an evil intention. That's why he became pope. Now, unfortunately, what happened is, once he became pope, he converted. He converted, and he condemned monothelitism instead of defining it. And Theodora was unhappy, so she sent another army to Rome, captured Vigilius, and brought him back to be killed and tortured by her. And on the way, he was an old bishop, old cardinal. From the rough treatment, he died on the journey. He never made it to Constantinople. He died on the journey. But even though he converted after becoming pope, it's very clear, according to the definition of Archbishop of Vigano, there's no question. There is question about Pope Francis, but there's no question about Pope Vigilius. He clearly had, according to Archbishop of Vigano, a defect of consent. And the church fathers, the doctors, the theologians, all universally accept Vigilius as one of the true popes. Because the why, he became pope with a circumstance of why. He became pope, how? By murdering the real pope. And he became pope in order to define what? The heresy of monothelitism. All these are circumstances. Papacy is something else. What is a circumstance? He became pope in order to define a heresy. Actually, that's a why. He became pope by murdering the previous pope. And then he converted. And the church has accepted universally Vigilius is in the list of the 264 true popes. The idea that your internal consent, which can only be known to God and yourself anyway, invalidates an election and an appointment to office, means that we could never know anyone to be a real pope or a real bishop or a real priest. The argument is absurd. And yet, it's an argument that appeals to modern man because it appeals to the fact he's a bad man. And a bad man, an evil man, should not be pope. Also, because it's a slightly different argument, you can take people like Brian McCall and Christopher Ferrara and Michael Matt and so on. I think Michael Matt was more against him. And others who would say, well, it's not the same as Sanborn's argument, Bishop Sanborn, not the same as Father Cicada's argument. It's still different, so maybe he's not a sedevacantist. And also, he accepted Pope Benedict as the pope, so we're going to redefine what it means to be sedevacantist. Now, there are three accusations against Archbishop Vigano. Then that is that he denies the legitimacy of the papacy of Pope Francis due to defective consent. Second, he refuses communion with him. Now, the refusal of communion with him, he demonstrated clearly, both in his letters of the last few months, Archbishop Vigano, and also in his behavior of the 20th of June. He said he did not go to the trial, and he did not send extrajudicial trial, and he did not send a representative. And he said it's because Bergoglio has a Bergoglian church. He calls it's a Bergoglian church and a Bergoglio church. He says it's a consequence of Vatican II. That's to make us people happy. But the third part is good. First is problem with legitimacy of the Pope. Wrong. Pope Francis is the Pope, and he was legitimately elected. Second, refusing communion with him, which he does refuse communion. He says the Bergoglian Church is not a Catholic church, and he calls it a Bergoglian Church. He does say it's a consequence of Vatican II, but he doesn't call it the Vatican II Church, he calls it the Bergoglian Church. Because, according to Archbishop Vigano, Benedict XVI, he was still a good pope, and so going backwards to John Paul II and so on. So he accepts those. but it's a Bergoglian church. And we call it a Bergoglian church and not a Vatican II church. That appeals to all conservatives. Archbishop Vigano is appealing to all sides. He's appealing to all sides of the good guys. Our sedevacantism is just as wrong today in 2024 as it was in 1958 and in 1963 and in 1978 and 78 again and in 2005 and 2013 and today. It's still wrong. The argument is still essentially the same. Evil man with evil purpose doing evil things cannot be Holy Father. But an evil man with evil purpose can be Holy Father, can be bishop, can be priest. And this is the power of our church. The church has the place for them. That the holiness of the church does not come from the holiness of the priest. That's why the best quote is that of St. Thomas Aquinas, where he says, just as the faith of the priest does not make Christ present in the Blessed Sacrament. When I believe Christ is present, and I firmly believe he is, it doesn't make him present. I have no power to believe Christ into the host. It is the power of the priesthood that makes Christ enter the host. So just as the faith of the priest does not make Christ present, so also the removal of the faith of the priest cannot take him away. The same is true of the rock of our church. The rock of our church is Petrus. The rock of our church is the chair of St. Peter, is the Pope. And it is not the faith of the Pope that makes our church, but the Pope that makes our church. And that's a heresy condemned in the Council of Trent. The foundation of Archbishop Vigano's error of sedevacantism is based on the heresy of the Protestants condemned at the Council of Trent. The Protestants taught in the 1500s that the Holy Roman Catholic Church is built on Peter's confession of faith. Remember in Caesarea Philippi, our Lord Jesus Christ asked, who do men say the Messiah is? And some say John the Baptist. And some say Elias or one of the prophets. And he said, whom do you say that I am? St. Peter said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. That was Peter's profession of faith. This is what the Protestants say the church is built on. Peter's confession of faith. Next verse, Matthew 16 through 18. Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon son of John, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to thee. For thou art Peter. He changed his name. Blessed art thou, Simon. You're no longer Simon. You were Simon the son of John 2 seconds ago. Now thou art Peter. And upon Peter means rock. Thou art Cephas. Thou art rock. And upon this rock I will build my church. St. Peter made a profession of faith. Christ said, blessed art thou, Simon, son of John. And then he said, thou art Peter. Christ did not build his church on Peter's confession of faith. He built the church on Peter. And the Council of Trent condemned as a heresy. If anyone says that the church is built on Peter's confession of faith, let him be anathema. The church is not built on Peter's confession of faith. It is built on Simon Peter, the man himself. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And it's a dogma of our holy church that there will be living Peters on the chair of St. Peter from 33 AD until whatever day God decides to end the world. And so right now that man is Pope Francis. Before that it was Pope Benedict. Before that it was Pope John Paul II. And you can go all the way back to Linus, Cletus, Clement, the three successors of St. Peter. and then St. Peter himself. So that it's that the error of Archbishop Vigano is built on the Protestant heresy that it takes faith to be a pope. It takes faith to be a priest, faith to be a bishop, or even internal faith to be a Catholic. St. Robert Bellarmine says, it is not required to have, can a heretic be a Catholic? And he says, yes. The so-called occult heretic, he is a Catholic. He clearly believes in all the heresies, or whatever heresies he chooses to believe in, but he was baptized. He professed externally to be a Catholic. He belongs to the Catholic Church of St. Willibrord, and he has not left the church. He's a Catholic. The Catholic Church is visible. Same is true of faithful. Same is true of priest, bishop, and pope. So this idea that he has a defect of consent, which is built on the accusation that not only does Pope Francis not have the faith, not only is he a heretic, because there are many people who don't have the faith and are heretics, but don't want to destroy other people, or don't want to destroy the Catholic Church. They just don't agree with it, or they doubt it. Because remember, heretic is one who either doubts or denies any dogma of faith. You don't have to deny it. If you doubt it, you're a heretic, because faith is absolute certitude, no doubt. So there are many heretics who are heretics, living in the state of mortal sin as heretics, but they don't work for the destruction of the church intentionally or actively. So in the case of Pope Francis, we're saying he is specifically working for the destruction of the church. Now, when you look at all the evil things he's doing, there are many multiple motivations, one of which is the standard motivation of women, money, and power and glory. Those are the usual reasons why men do wicked things. It's very rare they do them for high motives. One example is the most wicked priest in the history of the world of the Old Testament. His name was Caiaphas. And unless there be any confusion, it's the Holy Ghost that said he handed Christ over because of jealousy. Because we might think maybe Caiaphas was a Satanist. Maybe Caiaphas believes in all the heresies. Caiaphas was not a heretic. Caiaphas was not a Satanist. Caiaphas was a murderer. Caiaphas was probably very impure. Caiaphas didn't really care about the truth. But Caiaphas killed our Lord Jesus Christ, who is God. And Caiaphas was the high priest, the one principally responsible for the death of Christ. And it was because of jealousy. When you look at the real world evil choices made by men, they're very often made for very small reasons, not for big ones. Like I forget the name of was it the general in the Battle of Gettysburg? Was it Longstreet? Which one came in late? Maybe it came in late. The cavalry general. What? Was it Jeb Stuart? I'm getting confused now. What? He came late. Remember, he went. It was Jeb Stuart. Well, Jeb Stuart had a girlfriend who lived in a small town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Actually, it was the next town over. But his best scout, who was really trusted by General Lee, had a girlfriend by the same name who lived in the same town. So, you got the general who's got a girlfriend in a small town named Gettysburg. You got the best scout who's under him, and he's going to send him out ahead in advance to be the eyes of General Lee. Because he might stop at the girlfriend's house to see how the situation is there. So what did he do? He made the best scout in General Lee's army watch the baggage. He sent a moron ahead to be the head of the scouts. And it was one of the principal causes, they say, of the death. It was a general at West Point giving a speech. He says, when you're a general, don't just know what the battlefield situation is, know what your commander's situation is. Because you may have under you this sergeant and that lieutenant who maybe don't get along. Or maybe they got a girlfriend, and it's very possible when you give a command, they're going to use this opportunity to do a Uriah situation, get somebody wasted, or make a bad decision they wouldn't normally make because of a girlfriend. In the real world, very wicked decisions are made for very lame reasons. And so it's very possible that the wicked Pope Francis doing the wicked things he's doing is just because that's what his friends like. That's what gives him power, and that's what he believes in because he's a liberal. It's not necessarily that he has specifically become Holy Father in order to satanically destroy the church. Caiaphas did not have such a reason when he crucified Christ. So to argue defective consent based on these internal motivations is useless. It's not valuable. It's ridiculous. And that and that they're looking at the situation in completely the wrong way. But it's interesting because it's trying to say things in a different way so that it will cause confusion. And then that way, the sedevacantist and the anti-sedevacantist and all the resistance can all really like Archbishop Vigano. And so that he's now being a big promoter of a resurgence of sedevacantism, and they're trying to make a new brand of sedevacantism. The new sedevacantists don't like the old sedevacantists. Back in the time of the Arian heresy, it is said of the Arians who believe Jesus Christ is not true God, that he's only a man, the Arians did not only hate the Catholics. The Arians hated each other. There were many levels of Arians. There were Arians, semi-Arians, semi-semi-Arians, semi-semi-semi-semi-semi-Arians, and they would argue incessantly about how divine-like Jesus Christ was. Some thought he was like a biker, and some thought he was like an angel. And so they had all the levels in between, and they would argue incessantly, you're a liberal. And so if you would talk to an Arian, he would say, I'm not an Arian like him. Then if you're not an Arian like him, you must be Catholic. No. He's just a different kind of Arian. And now what we're seeing as Vatican II has developed, semi-Arianism, semi-semi-Arianism, semi-semi-semi-semi-semi-semi-Arianism, so that all the Novosordal people are having different levels. They're traditional, they're very traditional, they're very, very traditional, they're conservative, they're moderate, but essentially they all have essentially the same doctrine. The errors and heresies of Vatican II aren't the essential problem of our time. The divine constitution of the church is not still perfectly intact as it has been since the very beginning. And the answer to the crisis in the church is not the same as it's always been. Fulfill the faith of our fathers, live the faith of our fathers. So they're looking at a very different way of the dealing with the crisis of the church. All that's happening is that we're taking the same, there's a book called Old Errors, New Labels, a while ago. You just put new labels, but it's not a new error. Bishop Sheen used to say, whenever you see an idea that's totally new and you've never seen it before, go look at the Greeks. See how they put it, because they had it too. There is no new error such as evolution. That was taught by Democritus, a Greek that lived 500, 600 years before Christ. So that there isn't any new error under the sun. They just give a new label. They just change the tactics and style of it. And part of this whole new movement of Archbishop Vigano and this whole new battle, and it's interesting, the SSPX in its commentary, I wanted to ask you what your thought of the Archbishop, the SSPX commentary is, because it's a beautiful SSPX commentary. It says, in one sentence, let me pull that thing down again. There's only one sentence at the end. Let me see if you can find it. There are 3 accusations. Archbishop Lefebvre and the society he founded have not ventured down that perilous road. What does it tell you? Oh, excuse me, you got to read the sentence before. How does Following this summons, Vigano published a communique available online to respond to these accusations. He defends himself in various ways, invoking the doctrinal warnings of the current pontificate, rejecting neo-modernist errors, and asserting his case compares to that of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, also summoned in his time to the palace of the former Holy Office. There is, however, one point which significantly differentiates. That means other points may differentiate, but not significantly. Him from the founder of the Society of St. Pius X. Archbishop Vigano makes a clear declaration of sedevacantism in this text. In other words, according to him, Pope Francis is not Pope. And then how does he explain this? Defective consent. And Archbishop Lefebvre and the society he founded have not ventured down that perilous road. What kind of answer is that? Archbishop Lefebvre and the society have not ventured down that perilous road of saying that Pope Francis is not the Pope. Does it say he's not the Pope? Does it say he is the Pope? Say what? See how it's leaving things open? They're saying, even when they're saying something true, they make it sound questionable. So I think it's just down here at the bottom. What? No, this is that other idiot. Which idiot B? The other idiot. This is whoever this guy is, Knight, whatever. Right? You see this? We should point out, too, that there have been 34 anti-popes throughout the church. That reminds me of the, what do you call it? Which you ever seen the Manchurian Candidate? Where the idiot husband is told there are 73 card-carrying communists in the United States government. How many are there? There's 47 card-carrying communists. How many are there? There's 123. How many are there? Then he asks his wife, can I have just one number? I can't remember. They keep making fun of me because I keep changing the numbers. And the next day he said, there's exactly 23 card-carrying communists. So this is one of those. There's 34 anti-popes. So we should point out, too, there have been 34 anti-popes throughout the church history. And those that acknowledged them as such were not sedevacantist, but were the enlightened friends of God who refused to deceive a placeholder, be deceived by a placeholder. It was those of lesser grace who followed placeholders. Their prudence earned them no points. We call this peanut butter, just so you know. Peanut butter. Right? Yes. So what does that mean? What? Yeah, yes.
Was there never a point in history that the chair of Peter was vacant for more than a short period of time?
The longest period is between the time when St. Peter Celestine was elected. That's 2.5 years. Now, the common argument of the sedevacantists is whenever one pope dies, there's a gap to the next pope. So therefore, the chair is vacant. And therefore, there can be a gap. And that's a very foolish argument because obviously when you breathe, you have to breathe in, and then you're not breathing. But if you don't breathe for 3 hours, you're going to be dead. And if there isn't a gap in your breathing, guess what? You're going to be dead. So obviously, since there's only one pope, there has to be a death, then there has to be a brief period of time, and then an election. And there's a moral connection between one and the other. The longest it's ever been is 2.5 years and 2,000 years. And that was a very bad thing. That's where the St. Peter Celestine, he's the one that complained about it. He was a monk. He was a layman.
He was in prison?
He was in prison afterwards, yes. See, he was a monk in the cave somewhere in Italy. And he said, you cardinals have not done your duty. You have waited over 2 years to elect a pope. You must elect a pope or you will be cursed and condemned by God. So they went out, captured him, brought him into Rome, and made him pope. That's how he became pope. He didn't want to become pope. And then he was a horrible pope. He was a great saint, but he was a horrible pope. He was a nice Franciscan. He was a hermit, didn't know anything. I don't think he ever learned how to say Mass. He was a priest, consecrated bishop. I don't believe he ever said Mass. He couldn't understand Latin. I don't think he ever said Mass. I don't think he ever heard a confession. He just became pope. They ordained him a priest, and they consecrated him a bishop, and then he was pope. So he put a mitre on his head and put a tiara on his head, and he was pope. But he was a really bad pope. Because the Franciscans would come in and say, you need to excommunicate the Dominicans. Okay, so we excommunicate the Dominicans. Dominicans came in, you got to excommunicate Franciscans. Okay, so he excommunicated the Franciscans. And then the next guy came in and said, you need to do this. He goes, okay. And so he kept making contradictory decrees one after another because he didn't know what he was doing. So he resigned. He's his great, Pope of humility, you know. And then Pope Boniface VIII, who was not a bad pope, he was actually a good pope, he put him in jail because he knew, to protect him actually, because he knew that the wicked men would come and manipulate him. So he just locked him up. He was fine with that because he lives in a prison anyway. So it wasn't a punishment. It was just because of the wickedness of other men. And Boniface VIII's been accused of evil because of that, but he actually did the right thing, and he wasn't a bad pope.
Because I think the Senator Pontiffs used those two as their example of there being two cases, because remember, like with Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, they're both being, we have two popes and all that, and they used that example, I think, a lot.
Sometimes use the example of the three popes and the Great Western Schism. But in the case of the Great Western Schism, every Catholic on earth knew either the Pope in France is the Pope, in which case he's the head of the church, or the Pope in Rome is the Pope. The church is still intact. They knew that I'm following the true Pope or I'm following a false Pope, but there's a real visible Pope. There was no confusion. It was just which one is that visible Pope? The whole world knew there was one in Rome, one in Avignon. And so one of them was the real Pope, the other one wasn't. The one that was nice was the anti-Pope. The one that was the murderer was the real Pope. The real Pope murdered his first act as Pope was to murder 9 cardinals. He forced them to elect him. He wanted it 100%. He said, I am the man of God, and everyone must elect me. Most of the cardinals elected him after he put him at gunpoint, or sword point, I guess, at the time. But 9 of them refused to elect him. So his first act of Pope was to make 9 millstones. And he put them around the neck of the 9 cardinals and drowned them in the Tiber. And he said, remember, it's a greater scandal. It's better to be drowned in the sea with a millstone tied about your neck than to scandalize these brethren. And the fact they didn't elect him was a scandal. So he threw him in the... Then the other cardinals got mad because he murdered the 9 cardinals. They had a second conclave, elected a new pope, and then you had 2 popes. The murderer was the real pope, and the anti-pope was the nice guy. And so, but in any case, so there have been many, wicked popes in history, but that doesn't fit the sedevacantist situation, because here we're talking about only one pope. But the Society of St. Pius X statement, another thing about it also, I've just noticed reading it now like 3 or 4 times, it doesn't say clearly sedevacantism is wrong. It says we didn't go down that path. We didn't go down that perilous road. And then he says there's only one significant difference between Archbishop of Vigano and Archbishop of Fèvre, and that is he didn't go down the perilous road of sedevacantism. Now, there were 3 accusations that were made. In the old days, CC Nono and the SSPX, if that had happened, say, in the 1970s or 80s or even early 90s, we would say, okay, point 1, Archbishop of Vigano rejects the legitimacy of the election of Pope Francis. Answer, Pope Francis was legitimately elected. He's just a bad pope. Point 1, Vigano is wrong. Point 2, Vigano refuses communion with the Bergoglian Church. That's wrong. There is no Bergoglian Church. There is a heretical church of Vatican II, not a Bergoglian Church. And he refuses communion with the Pope, which is wrong. We don't refuse communion with the Pope. We disobey the Pope in all his wicked commands. And we maintain the fidelity to the true faith. We must, as faithful servants of Pope Francis, just like Archbishop of Fèvre remained a faithful servant of Pope Paul VI by chastising him, by standing up against his errors. Point number 3, Vatican II is schismatic, is heretical, is vomit, and needs to be thrown in the garbage can. That's an old SSPX answer. Point 1, point 2, point 3. What's the new SSPX answer? There's no significant difference between, there is at least one significant difference between Vigano and Archbishop of Fèvre. There's quite a few differences. Vigano said the new Mass, Archbishop of Fèvre didn't. Vigano is saying Bergoglio is not the Pope. Archbishop of Fèvre says Pope John Paul II was the Pope, but he was supposedly excommunicated by him. And he didn't tolerate the error of sedevacantism. And he said it's an error. He didn't just say we have an opinion or something, or this is the way we feel. You have a statement, and it doesn't clearly, and then Vatican II, it doesn't even say Vigano was correct about the errors of Vatican II, that that's a schismatic church, that that's the heresies of Vatican II. So the answer, the statement leaves itself open. I went to the SSPX website to look for the statement. You can't find it. It's there, but you can't find it. You have to type, you have to know the statement exists. You have to type it in, search it directly, and then it shows up in FSSPX News, but it's not in the headlines. You can't find it in the headlines, which is a normal problem of today. And that's just a few days ago. It was supposed to be breaking news, you know. But so that the response of, to go here, the response, Archbishop Lefebvre, the society founded, did not venture down that perilous road. See, one of the problems with the new SSPX, even when they say something right, they say it in such a way that it's just an opinion. One of the things Archbishop Lefebvre, Bishop Sheen used to say, you can be as nice as you want to be to heretics, Protestants, atheists. You can be as kind and understanding as you want to be. But never present the truth as an opinion. You can say you've got a good point, and that's a very good point. As I understand where you're coming from. This is very nice. That's very good. That's a good start. But you never, ever have the right to present the truth as an opinion. It must always be presented as a truth. And one of the troubles of the new society is even when they say something that's true, they say it like, even though they said something true, they didn't say it with oomph. They didn't say it correctly. They didn't say it as, this is the truth, even when they say something that's true. And so they're right to condemn Archbishop Vigano for being schismatic. They're right to condemn Archbishop Vigano for not accepting the legitimacy of Pope Francis. But they do it in such a way that you don't know what's really wrong with Archbishop Vigano. They didn't explain the problem of defective consent. Notice it explains defective consent. It doesn't say what's wrong with it. It's another thing they often do. They said, Vigano, he says this, but then they don't explain why it's wrong. Standard procedure, right? How does Vigano explain this? Because of a, quote, defective consent, unquote, from Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio when accepting the papacy. And by the way, they explain it wrongly. That is, according to Vigano, Cardinal Bergoglio considered the papacy as something other than what it really is, which is not the argument of Archbishop Vigano. He accepted the pontifical office without fully consenting, and this error resulted in a nullity of his acceptance. His pontificate would therefore be that of a placeholder. He's quoting these guys, these new words they use. Archbishop Lefebvre never went down that path. Where's the explanation of why that's a bunch of garbage? Where's the explanation of why it's wrong, what precisely is wrong? There's no education of the truth. So that even when they're saying something that's kind of right, they carefully say it so that it comes out wrong. And it doesn't increase or strengthen the faith. It doesn't make clear what the problem is. So this thing against this is a statement of somebody. Actually, this guy is a Novus Ordo guy. At first, it sounds like he might be a sedevacantist, but then it turns out he's a sedevacantist. If you just write down and go down to the next one, the very end, he says what the SSPX should do. It's just after this. Right at the driving. What should the SSPXs? The Novus Catholics, we say don't heed Francis. He says SSPX is the same because they don't heed Francis. Go to the very bottom. There it is. Hence, SSPX should always encourage Catholics to fight for tradition within their parish churches. So first, the guy sounds like a standard sedevacantist, and then this junk comes up at the end. Hence, the SSPX should always encourage Catholics to fight for tradition within their parish churches, while at the same time encouraging them to periodically attend TLM masses to help clear their head and show to others what type of spirituality they relate to.
What's the difference between a society, parish church, and a TLM mass?
Oh, there's a redundancy. See this? Traditional Latin mass. No, for him, there's no difference. Not only that, parish churches, it means you continue to go to the Novus Ordo, right? So this guy's a Novus Ordo guy. But it all starts like he sounds like a sedevacantist at the very beginning. What's happening is sedevacantist, anti-sedevacantist, the resistance, everybody is starting to look the same. You can't tell the difference anymore. Because the battle is really switched to, well, as long as you got your Latin Mass and you believe in Jesus.
And their feelings, it sounds like it's all about feelings up there.
Yeah, you see, it's very, and this idea that sedevacantists are bad because they're sedevacantists, it's just become a label. They are wrong, but it's not a label. He makes it into a label. And Vigano's a good guy. Sedevacantists are bad guys. Therefore, Vigano's not a sedevacantist. Yeah.
I was going to ask, what is the defective consent that Vigano is talking about that, for instance, this guy thinks is so clear that can't also depend on the notes before?
Well, Vigilius is a clear example of that. And why not Paul VI? Why not John the 23rd, who came, when John 23rd became Pope, he left a Masonic lodge to go get elected. Francis didn't do that. He left a Pizza Hut or something and got on a bus. So whereas Pope John Paul II, Roncalli, Pope John 23rd, he left the Masonic lodge, was congratulated for being the future Pope. Then he went to the conclave. And he became the future Pope. That doesn't sound good, does it? So that sounds like he certainly had a bad intention.
Well, and this guy sounds like he's been a trad a while.
I think this guy must be a Novus. I mean, here's another challenge that I haven't watched Taylor Marshall for a long time. I just watched a few days ago on this gardener. He said, I want to get the comments of the people. You know, one of the most intelligent comments he really liked was made by Star Wars Blaster 23. Because, I agree with Star Wars Blaster 23. I mean, that's the man. I mean, if you like the new Luke Skywalker, he may be Vader someday later, but right now, he's just a small fry. I mean, this is ridiculous. And so you have and this guy here, his name is nowhere on the, you go to the top, it's Knight Crusader, probably some druggie in his room. I mean, go to the top. What is it?
David Martin.
Oh, where's the name? You found the Martin. No, he's a quote-unquote famous guy, right? There he is. David Martin, right? But this is, what do you call it? I mean, this is ridiculous. And then you got Super Blaster 23, what he has to say, Star Wars 27 and Darth Vader 33. I mean, this is really absurd. So it's interesting, I think it's really clear what's happening right now, reading the history of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The priests, in the time of the Maccabees, the priests were all wicked. There were only 200 faithful priests that didn't offer the false sacrifice. When the true sacrifice came back, the priests didn't become saints. The priests were still basically wimpy and weak priests, and they weren't really, practicing their faith. So a group of laymen rose up called the Pharisees, who they could not worship because they weren't priests, so they couldn't do worship in the temple. So they built synagogues where they would gather together and they would teach and preach. And they would teach and do catechism. Because they were very serious and they were in favor of the Maccabees, who were good guys, and they were being firm in the Jewish religion, the people started listening to the Pharisees rather than listening to the priests. And the Sadducees were priests, and they were all liberals. The people lost respect for the priests. The Pharisees gained more respect than the priests because they were more serious. And that's what's happening right now. People have much more respect for Taylor Marshall, Michael Matt, all these guys. Like David Martin, he's one of the semi-famous ones, isn't he? I know his name, so I know his name. But there's a bunch of them. I just know that name. I don't know who he is. So, and that there's all these guys that are experts. What? There's a whole bunch of them, right? And so, depending on where you're from, and they're all laymen that are commenters about the faith, and they're all experts. And people want to hear what they have to say rather than what the priest has to say, because the priests have basically been useless. They've taken over the role of the Pharisees, just as in the time of Christ. Not all Pharisees were wicked. Gamaliel, who was the teacher of St. Paul, he was a very holy Pharisee. And St. Paul himself was a Pharisee, Saul of Tarsus. And then later on, of course, he became St. Paul. But the thing is that Gamaliel, who was his teacher, was actually a holy, he's revered as a saint, even though he's directly canonized. He's revered as a saint in our church. Gamaliel, because he died before Christ's crucifixion, so we don't call him a saint, but he was revered as such. Gamaliel was a Pharisee. Also, of course, was Nicodemus was a Pharisee, and he's a saint. So there were some good Pharisees, but the Pharisees in general became very corrupt. And it says they became the ones that were respected more than the priests, and they became the guiders and directors of the people because of their being an example. And what's happening now, I think, is that these laymen, some of them good, some of them very proud, some of them bad, all levels in between. But in any case, they've taken the place of the priests. Priests no longer have authority. Priests are no longer respected, good or bad. It's the experts that are going to be listened to, and that are these laymen. One of the troubles of the laity running things, of course, God didn't intend the church to be run that way. It's to be run by those who are deputed by God to run it. But also, the priests have the grace of God to be in the hierarchy of the church. If your priest decides not to say Mass and hear confessions, you can't fill in for him. You can't do that. So you can live your faith, but you can't do priest things to live your faith. So, but now what's happening, because priests have been so much of a failure throughout the last 60 years especially, that many faithful feel like they're obliged to fill in the place of the priest. And it's the priest's fault. It's not really the faithful's fault, but the situation is still bad. And it's becoming worse and worse. And the example, reading through this, I wasn't going to go through the theological aspects of this argument, but it is a bit long, and I wanted to hit it. His argumentation of why Pope, this is much better than the SSPX presentation, by the way. That's written by a priest. That's written by a layman, right? So at least it's more intelligible. It's not correct, but it's more intelligible, and at least you can understand what he's saying and what he's arguing. He makes mistakes, but he's at least going to understand what he's saying when he's arguing. The SSPX is you don't know where they really stand, and so with Mr. Martin, you do know where you have, at least you know what he believes and what he stands and why he gives some argumentation. But the argumentation is all basically based on good guy, bad guy, rather than on theology and philosophy. And that we have to stand on theology and philosophy. And I know it's a bit late there. In any case, I was going to go through this, but we don't have time to do that. And I think I already covered some of the points anyway. But in any case, we'll close it. Any other questions or whatever, then we'll close with the prayer because it's already 4 o'clock. All right? Yes? Yeah, of course, not every priest is going to fail, but it is true that Bishop Williams told us that in the seminary. He says, when you become a priest, you go out in the battlefield. Don't expect everyone to respect you. And don't blame them because they don't respect you. Because why is it that people don't respect the priest? Because the priest gave away their authority. The priest earned their disrespect. Because in the last 60 years, what's happened? We got homosexual priests, we got pedophilia priests, we got priests that are teaching every kind of heresy, we got priests that are not doing their duty. You have every conceivable sin that can be committed by a human being has been committed by the priests in an open and public manner in the last 60 years. And the priests, even though they should still be respected, of course, because of the priesthood, the fact remains the priest is the one who is to blame for the lack of the respect of the priesthood. He said, of course, people should respect, I'm the padre, you're supposed to respect me. Well, that's true because we have the priesthood of our Lord Jesus Christ in us. But look at what happened. And it's also a prophecy of Our Lady of Good Success. Because of wicked priests, people will lose their respect for all priests. Remember, it's one of her prophecies. Because of wicked priests, people will lose their respect for all priests, and they will begin to hate all priests. We're in that time right now. And even though we should be respected because we're priests, etc., that's true, but we shouldn't be overly worried about that, and we shouldn't be overly surprised that we're not respected. And imagine the priests were doing their duty, and the priests were teaching the truth, then no one would listen to these laymen. But yeah.
But I think that a reason why with the popular Catholic, or with the mainstream Catholic culture, that, like, I guess is so respected in a lot of ways, even though,
He's respected because he's he's the highest member of the hierarchy since Vatican II, even though he's retired, to actually speak out in some way. He was the apostolic delegate to the most important country in the world. So that's a pretty significant position. And then now he's speaking up. So obviously he has a following that other bishops won't have.
But he's not just speaking up just to hear his own voice. Oh, I don't know. But he resonates with people because those are true things that he writes.
Yes, he says many, many true things. Many true things. He knows exactly what to say. He says many true things, but I don't think he takes them to their proper conclusion. Like, for instance, he's sedevacantist. But the people that don't want to believe he's sedevacantist say, he's not a sedevacantist. It's just like when Alex Jones, 20 years ago, he interviewed an English guy, and he said, there's 2 million cameras in London? No, they're not. And they're taking away your freedom? Are you willing to look at that camera and say the camera doesn't exist? Okay, it doesn't exist. He says, I don't care if they take my freedom as long as they keep my liberty. Don't you realize freedom and liberty are the same thing? Well, I don't care. I said, okay. Are you willing to say that you don't care, and in the camera that you don't care? Okay, I don't care if they take my freedom as long as they keep my liberty. And look at the camera and say, that camera doesn't exist, that camera doesn't exist. I said, okay. That's what he did, guy in London. So the... He's pointing out the moral wickedness, if there is moral wickedness, and that's good. Right.
Well, Alex Jones actually, for quite a long time, has been a Zionist.
Right.
I digress on that.
Right.
But you get Vigano that will address these issues.
Yeah, he's addressing them.
Not,
He is. But he's...
The thing is that that's resonating because people are really hungry and thirsting for the whole truth.
But notice that his challenge of it is that he's resonating to people on different sides, and they're agreeing with him without changing their sides. See, what should happen is, I'm a Novus Ordo Catholic, and I see a tradition, the tradition is right, then I leave the Novus Ordo and become traditional. Or I'm a sedevacantist, and I see that non-sedevacant is right, so I stop being a sedevacantist. Or I'm not a sedevacantist, I begin to believe in sedevacantism, so I become a sedevacantist. That's not happening. The non-sedevacantists are still non-sedevacantists, but they agree with them. The sedevacantists are still sedevacantists, but they agree with them. The resistance, like Padre Hugo, is still the resistance, but they agree with them. So this is a new thing, that we stay where we are, and we agree with someone who we say is not the same as we are. If you're not something you're supposed to... Good. Okay. Right. So then what do you call it? So then in any case, sorry, distracted there. So John, you were going to say something?
I was going to say, with regard to respect to the priests, I was going to say, I know people who go to the Institute of Christ the King who refer to Pope Francis as Bergoglio, who refer to him as Buddy.
Right. There are many Christ the King priests and people, in Fraternity of St. Peter priests and people, and Novus Ordo priests and people, as well as traditional priests and people, who all believe Bergoglio is not the Pope.
But they don't want to come to your masses anymore because
Not approved.
you deposed the Pope.
Right. Yes. So that's, yeah.
Deposed Bergoglio.
Whom they think is not the Pope.
Buddy.
Right. Yes. So you have a case where they I'm not approved by the Pope who they say is not the Pope. Right. And so we're dealing with all kinds of contradictions across the board. But that's the nature of error as it develops. That's why only a miraculous intervention can cure this crisis. The truth is still clear. The truth is still one. But people are all over the place. Yeah, yes.
Would you say that with all of this stuff, because it feels like there's so much stuff for obviously a distraction, but I mean, wouldn't it just be so simple to go back to your basic catechism and that would kind of solve it?
Well, yes, we have to go back to the basic catechism, but part of the catechism is we had to be united to the Holy Father. We had to be united to the Holy Roman Church around us. And that, if you just have catechism without reference to the Mass and the situation of the church, it's really not sufficient. You have to react to the situation in the church today. And we have to be able to stand up against the errors, but we also have to do something practical. Like we have to say, for instance, we say, the Sedevacantists are good people. They got the Catholic faith. They're not bad people, but they're in error, right? And the error will cause harm to their soul, harm to the souls of their children. And if it continues, they'll eventually leave the Catholic faith, as many of them have already done. They will eventually leave the faith. Same thing with the Novus Ordo. They will eventually leave the faith. They are still baptized Catholics, but over time they're going to leave the faith. And what's happened? In the last 60 years, hundreds of millions of Catholics have left the faith. Many of them were good people 60 years ago who tried to be good on the inside. Now they're Protestants, they're atheists, they're outside the church, visibly. They're not just invisibly out of the church. And even if they still call themselves Catholics, they don't go to church anymore. But they started off as conservatives. They started off as being good. But when you follow that which is incorrect, it will eventually do you in. Now, many people, grace of God will preserve. But a great number will be done in. That's why that's why we need a truly miraculous intervention of heaven to truly win this present battle. So in any case, probably better. Anything else to really lay, we better pack it in. But yeah, yes.
So Bishop Sanborn is schism?
No. Archbishops, I would say that Bishop Sanborn is not in schism, because he's in grave error. He has the error of Sedevacantism. But the reason why he has that error is because he wants to be a good Catholic and stay in the church. He's in grave error. And is there an excuse for his error? Yeah, it's called the bad pope and the bad situation in the church today. It's still wrong, but that's why, for instance, those kind of Sedevacantists that go to his masses, for instance, if they're truly in schism, then I have to refuse them Holy Communion, because they're not in the church. If you're in schism, you can't receive Holy Communion, right? But they're in error. St. Augustine says it like this: no matter how grave the error or heresy is, if the person would accept the correction of the church, he's not a heretic. So you believe in the four persons of the Blessed Trinity. You believe in any other heresy. The famous the farmer believes in the four persons of the Blessed Trinity. Well, obviously there's only three persons of the Blessed Trinity. My mommy told me there were four, and that's it. There's four. But why does he believe in the four persons? That's a heresy. Is he a heretic? No. Because he believes in the four persons, because he really believes that's what the church teaches. That's why he believes it. And if he understood the correction of the church, he would immediately reject his heresy and believe in the three persons. However, if he would refuse the correction of the church, then he's a heretic. Well, of course, only God knows which one's which. So St. Augustine therefore says, no matter how grave or serious is the error or heresy of an individual, if they would accept the correction of the church, they are not heretics. That's why they have when someone's accused of heresy, they're given 3 warnings, 3 opportunities to prove their pertinacity, their evil. Then they're declared heretics, right? Because it's not enough to believe the heresy, you have to believe it with pertinacity, that is, with a vicious will. Remember, heresy is not just an error, it's a sin. To be a sin, it has to be in the will. You have to know God wants me to believe he's God, and I refuse to believe he's God. You have to have a willed holding of error. No, you cannot go to the masses. You should not go. It's wrong. But the thing is, you go to the mass because it's incorrect. That doesn't mean they're all evil. Doesn't mean they're all not Catholic. Doesn't mean they're all going to hell. See what I mean? Just like the Novus Ordo. You should not go to the Novus Ordo. It's wrong. It's a sacrilege. But that doesn't mean all the people that go there are in heresy or are heretics or schismatics. Many of them are good people trying to keep their faith, and they have the state of grace and they have the faith. But they're in grave error. And that error causes damage to them, and if it persists, it will take away their faith. Right? Yes?
With what you just said, how is it that with the internet and everything, that basically the Novus Ordos, they live under a rock? Like, how have they not at least found the SSPX?
It's almost impossible. We are so small. We have a few thousand priests throughout the whole world. No, it's impossible. There are people even in the area that they don't know we exist, right? No, it's very easy to not find us, right?
Right, not find you, but the SSPX.
No, it's not. The SSPX is less than 1,000 priests. The Louisville Diocese has 400 priests in it. That's in an area of 50 miles, 50 miles. And it's not enough priests to cover the diocese. There's, 100,000 priests in the world. Well, maybe more than that, but at least 100,000. There's 8,000 bishops. And that's not enough. They have a shortage of priests. It's not enough to even give holy. Imagine if everybody showed up at Mass one Sunday. It'd be impossible to give them Holy Communion. It'd be impossible to fit them on the property, much less in the it'd be impossible. But fortunately, they never show up. You don't have to worry about it. What? Yes.
Speak to the recent, more recent stuff with Francis about just more recent.
Is anybody ready to die right about now?
National Latin Mass.
What? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
The more recent attacks with the Latin Mass.
The latest rumor is on July 16th, he's supposed to shut down the Latin Mass, which he probably won't. He'll just say maybe another restriction of some kind. It would be nice if he shut it down completely. Get rid of Ecclesia Dei Commission completely, which is theoretically closed anyway. Get rid of all legal masses completely, so that you can only say the Mass by standing for the faith. That'd be beautiful if he did that. We're not going to be that lucky. He's not going to do that.
Because I heard that some places, like the will petition, I just heard that they'll go, I've heard of this happening, that they'll go to their diocese and they'll petition then for, if they do the Latin Mass,
No, what's going to happen is,
become a shrine and be separated from the diocese.
yeah, that's what they're already doing that. One of them is St. Martin's in Louisville. St. Martin's is a 150-year-old parish. When, in 2022, what was it, the July 16th? True Traditionis Custodes. Was it 2020? What year was that? 2021, July 16th. In Traditionis Custodes, no Mass can be, Latin Mass can be said in a parish church. So in Louisville Diocese, St. Martin's Parish Church was turned into a shrine. It's no longer a parish church. So they still have the Latin Mass there. It was demoted from being a parish to just being a shrine. They've already done that. And then there are also bishops that are disobeying Pope Francis. But it creates an interesting moral problem because those bishops believe they're obliged to obey Pope Francis, but they don't care, so they're disobeying him. That means they're guilty of mortal sin. Remember, if your mommy tells you to take out the trash, that doesn't mean you're a saint. It might be a little brother standing down next to the mailbox, and the trash has a nuclear bomb in it, and you're going to take it and stick it next to the little brother and walk away and watch him get blown to smithereens. I'm just an obedient little girl, but I got a camera. I'm going to film the whole thing. Right now, because you obeyed mommy does not mean you're a saint. If you obey mommy to commit murder, the act of obedience becomes evil. See, to be good, an act must be all good, but to be evil needs only one defect. So right now, there are bishops disobeying the Pope because they don't care about the Pope. They're telling people to say the Latin Mass because their friends are telling them it's okay. They're not pleasing to God. They're not doing it because it's right. They're not doing it because they believe an obligation before God to do what's right. They're just trying to avoid headaches. And they hate the Pope more than they hate the local Latin Mass guys. They're not being warriors. They're not being soldiers of Christ. Not at all. So we're supposed to do that which is right because it's right. And look at the evil of a person. My bishop still gives me the Latin Mass in my diocese. Well, your bishop doesn't give you the Latin Mass, so too bad for you. But I've got it. Is that a spirit of Christ? That's evil, isn't it? We aren't the only ones who need the Latin Mass. Everyone needs the Latin Mass. I don't just need it in my diocese. I need it everywhere. I don't need it secretly with my priest because I'm buddies with my priest and we have a secret Latin Mass. What about the other poor people that aren't buddies with your priest? They don't get to have a Latin Mass. And why are they not getting it? Because you're not telling them about it, because the priest is keeping it from them, not because the bad guys are. So there are many people doing externally good things that are very displeasing to God. The old traditional priest, 1970, was very simple. I'm going to be a faithful priest, standing for the faithful Mass with a faithful church, helping souls wherever I can. That's it. Now, I'm going to take care of the people that take care of me. I'm going to make sure that only approved people know that I'm saying the secret Mass in the back of part of our Nova Soto church. I'm going to make a deal with the bishop so that he allows me to say the Latin Mass. It's ugliness, not of Christ. So many people do good things for evil reasons or not for reasons of Christ, and there will not come a reward because they do that. There will come a punishment. And don't forget about this other little fact. The Blessed Virgin Mary said very clearly, the situation of the church can get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until my victory. 1988, 2024. There's at least 10 times more Latin Masses in 2024 than there were in 88. There are many, many more Latin Masses. Tons more. But the world is not better. It's worse. Bringing back Latin Masses isn't going to bring back Christ. We have to bring back more than that.